An animatic is essentially a dress rehearsal for an incomplete animation. They usually don't use colour or even many in-betweens. They're typically just a set of keyframes with the odd transition between them to give an idea of what the final animation should look like, usually to plan the syncing of the visuals with audio of some kind. However, animatics have become their own art form on YouTube as they are easier to produce than fully fledged animations, while still providing engaging visuals set to music or dialogue. Many more people are getting into the business of animatics, so I'm making this video series on how to create one, based on my own experience. You can see on my channel that I've only released about 1.5 animatics publicly, but you'll have to take my word for it that I've worked on many more than just these two that haven't been published. I'm currently working on Heaven on Their Minds, but I was previously working on 2 other animatics for I Believe from Book of Mormon, as well as Freeze Your Brain and 17, both from Heathers. With this, I've learnt a lot about both of the key aspects of animatics, the art and the editing. This video is all about the art, so let's get started. I personally don't really physically storyboard my animatics. I have a specific vision in mind and I try to replicate it from scratch. This does take a long time, however, as there is the occasion where I can't get a certain pose or angle right, so I have to either toil over it until it looks right, or start over and think of something new. This is why I'd recommend drawing up a super rough storyboard at the beginning of the process, so you have an idea of what you want and are capable of producing. When storyboarding, consider the setting and orientation of the characters and set pieces. Imagine you're putting on a musical and you have to design the set. If it helps, you can draw up a blueprint to the area the animatic will take place in, and mark out where the character or characters move throughout it. If you have multiple locations, figure out a logic between them and how to make them distinct but connected in some way. You should also consider different angles and shots in your animatic while storyboarding. Just like live action, animation, and therefore animatics need diversity in camera work. Although there isn't a physical camera involved here, you should consider the placement of one as if there were in the universe your animatic takes place in. Here are some basic shots and their names. You may have heard of some. An establishing shot is a distance shot that establishes the setting. Good for animatics centered around one important place, so you can establish the geography as well as show off your skills in drawing landscapes, if you have any. You don't need a lot of detail in these shots, as they're taken from far away. The wide shot, or long shot, is another distance shot that shows the subject, your character, in their surroundings. This is good to follow up an establishing shot with, as you can show your audience where the character is situated in the setting, and establish what character, or characters, you're going to be following in the animatic. You still don't need much detail in these shots, so spend more time on making the outlines of the characters more distinct. The medium shot, or mid-shot, is a closer shot that shows most of your character, usually from the waist up. This is where you need to start adding detail. Not loads, just some defining features and maybe some shadows if you want a more dramatic look. This is a good shot for action, as you can see most of the character's body and their expressions should be clearer. This is the most popular shot in animatics, but is often overused to the detriment of the animatic's quality, as these shots are used as a shortcut because you don't usually need to draw legs or sometimes hands or hooves. These shots are not always used as well as they could be, with many animatics being composed almost entirely of waist-up, front-on shots of the character talking or singing. While it's easier this way, there's not a lot of point in doing an animatic if the camera isn't moving with the character. It also gives the video the same feel as one of those YouTube rant sprites, and in general can come off as lazy if overused and not utilised well. To avoid this, try using different angles with these shots, which I'll go into later, to make it more dynamic and dramatic. The close-up is a good shot for expressions, which are perhaps most important in animation, as the key difference between animation and live action is that everything can be exaggerated and intensified. Like mid-shots, close-ups can be from a variety of angles to create drama or comedy or anything in between. They're good for conversations too, as you can do an over-the-shoulder close-up that easily creates a traditional setup for a conversation, and is effective in showing the character's expressions. Don't overuse these either, however. Use them when you want to show off a particularly animated expression, or else if you want to create suspense by closing in on the character and hiding what they're reacting to. I probably don't need to explain that close-ups need a lot of detail, as the character is now taking up the majority of the screen. The extreme close-up is best for objects of note that you want to bring to the audience's attention, or else if you want to close up on a character's eyes in an emotional scene or for comedy purposes. Remember, the more exaggerated something is, the more likely it is to create either drama or comedy, depending on how you time it. Use extreme close-ups very sparingly, if only because they're a pain as you have to draw in immense detail. So, those are the main types of shot that you'll be using in your animatics. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, as I mentioned earlier, you can make your shots more dynamic by changing up the angles. Whenever using a particularly extreme angle, however, consider its meaning when used in the context of the story. The flat angle, neutral angle, or eye level shot is a very, very, very common shot in simple animatics on YouTube. Now, there's nothing wrong with economising on angles to save time, especially since these artists are doing it for free and for fun. But if you want your animatic to be interesting and generate a real emotional response, you want to avoid too many of these. Use the neutral angle in moderation, or else, if you're going to use it, make the composition interesting. We'll talk about that later. If you're not sure what I mean by eye-level shot, imagine a 9-square grid across your frame. Now imagine that the characters are standing face-on at the camera, and their eyes match up with the top line of the grid. This is an eye-level shot, and it tends to create little to no emotional response in the viewer on its own, hence neutral. Again, diverse composition can help create different effects even with a neutral angle, but you don't want your animatic to be composed of purely mid-shots at a neutral angle, as this will look boring and make your art look flat and lifeless. High and low angles are some of my favourites and are perfect for drama and sometimes for comedy. Low angle shots of a character make the character appear powerful or heroic, whereas high angle shots of a character make them look weak, helpless, or just emphasises how physically smaller they are than other characters. Depending on how extreme the angle is, you may not want to use these too much. Less extreme degrees of this shot are fine to use as much as you like, as long as the effect is right for what you're going for. The 3/4 angle is more about your characters than the position of the imaginary camera, but just as you don't want to overuse the neutral angle, you don't want to overuse profile or face-on pictures of your character. The 3/4 angle is very popular among artists as it instantly creates a three-dimensional effect for the character and makes them pop off the page. As much as people like to disparage this angle in art as they call it lazy, it's actually a really decent way to keep your characters looking dynamic throughout the animatic. As long as they don't only ever stand at a 3/4 angle to one particular side, it won't appear lazy and will rather help to create dynamic, interesting action. Make sure you practice your 3/4 drawing skills beforehand if you're not used to it, however, as the anatomy can be tricky. A profile is essentially the same as a flat angle, except now we're referring to the orientation of the character again. A character profile is where they are stood side onto the frame and we can only see half of their face. This is good for creating a sense of symmetry, as with the front-on shots, and is perfect for tracking shots, which we'll talk about in the next video when we discuss editing. Like front-on shots, these can make your characters look flat if overused, so use them in moderation. The key to animation and film in general, really, is simply be diverse. Overusing any of these aspects that I've mentioned renders their effect void as they lose their significance, so be sure to mix it up and keep it fresh. After you've sketched out a rough storyboard, it's time to make sure that you know your characters inside and out. Plan how they're going to look in the animatic, and, even if it's tiring, try to draw them in this appearance several times until it comes naturally and you remember every aspect. Then, create a character reference with 3 different renderings of your character. One should be them facing front on, one should be them at a 3/4 angle, and one should be from behind. If you want to, you can make annotations where you think necessary to remind yourself of important aspects whenever you check the reference. This will help you when you're drawing the frames, as you'll know every feature that you want to have, and if you're rendering them in colour, you'll also be able to colour pick from the reference so that every frame is coherent. Now it's time to experiment with different types of movement. Look up poses online and sketch your character in their complete form in these poses. If you can't get one right, keep practicing. Familiarise yourself with your character's anatomy and how they move. This will help you convey the right movements in your animatic, as well as brush up on your cartooning skills, as you can mess around with how their body moves according to how wacky you want to get. If you're a relatively new artist, you will need to develop your own distinct style. This isn't as daunting as it sounds. In reality, your style is whatever way you end up drawing things when you set pen to paper. For an animatic, however, you'll have to get pretty good at drawing the same thing in a consistent way so that you don't have a bunch of different styles across multiple frames, and so the whole scene looks unified. Your style will also need to reflect the tone of the song or scene that you're animating. While I'm not suggesting that any style is lesser, certain styles don't fit certain tones. The recently popular Steven Universe style, while cute and super fun to draw with, isn't always the right fit for serious songs or scenes. This doesn't mean that you have to completely change your style, but you'll need to adapt it somewhat to suit the tone. Using sharper, rougher lines or less saturated colours will instantly transform your style to fit the mood of the project, and you don't need to learn an entirely different way of drawing. Equally, if your style is more anime-esque and very angular and dramatic, but you like to do a more light-hearted, easy animatic, rounding the shapes of the characters and using lighter colours and fewer shadows will make your style fit the tone better and contribute to more suitable visuals. If your animatic features multiple characters, you should make sure that they're distinct. In my Turn It Off animatic, almost all the ponies have exactly the same haircut and cutie mark, with their only differences being some different body types, when I bothered to make this obvious, and didn't just copy and paste the same model several times, and different appendages like the horn or the wings. The most distinct character was Cunningham, as he had a different haircut and a consistently squat stature. This was deliberate, as Cunningham is seen as the weirdo that Elder Price feels ashamed of being partnered with, and it also made him look more friendly and kind, whereas I tended to draw Elder Price with sharper features sometimes. There are many flaws with this animatic, but I did consider ways to distinguish the characters from one another when I remembered. At times you can see that Pop-Tarts is drawn more lanky, and McKinley with rounder, more feminine features. Again, this was my first ever animatic, and I didn't always consider consistency with my drawings, as the process did take me about 2 or 3 months. Making your characters distinct without colour may seem tricky, but just so long as there is a particular, obvious, defining feature about the character that you can accentuate, you can get away with a fairly simplistic design otherwise. A character with a single chunk of hair that sticks up, for instance, or a character with very distinctive clothes, or simply a different face shape that remains consistent throughout, can help set them apart and make them distinct. When you feel totally comfortable with your character and style, you can start drawing. You won't make an animatic in a day, however, and especially if this is your first time making one, you should always start a session with some warm-up sketches of your characters, as well as a refresh of the project so far. This is so that your art doesn't drastically change in quality or style between frames, as you may, depending on your familiarity with your characters, have forgotten how to draw them in the way that you had before. This is less of a problem when you've been doing it for a while and your muscle memory allows you to draw them consistently, but even then it's a good idea to warm up by sketching them a couple of times, as well as referring to your storyboard and character references. I'll go into this in the next video, but you should also ideally be editing your animatic as you make it, so that you can watch it back each time you add a frame to see how it flows. These warm-up sessions are a perfect time to re-watch what you've done so far and remind yourself of where you left off, so that you can get back into the right mindset when drawing. As you draw, remember to refer to previous frames and even try layering your drawings over the old frames with a lower opacity, similar to an onion skin tool for animation, so that you can stay on model and make the change between frames more seamless. Depending on what style you're going for, you'll need to make sure that each frame is consistently clean and polished. If you're going for a super sketchy, rough art style, then this is less of an issue, but still make sure that some frames aren't significantly more or less polished than the others, unless it is purposeful and there is a reason for it. Everything you draw should have a purpose, as unlike a medium like theatre, and even more so than film, you have complete control over what the audience sees, and so you should make sure that every single thing in the frame has a purpose in the shot. This is true of films as well, but where filmmakers can't always make the actors look exactly as they want them to, or get objects that have exactly the right texture, you can, as you have all the power, so make it count. If you're colouring, make sure the colours are consistent, and, as mentioned, that the quality of colouring is consistent. If you're going for a messy, outside-the-lines colouring look, then you shouldn't have a random frame where everything's polished and tidy. Once again, if you have a reason to have that frame that's more or less tidy than the rest, you can go ahead, but otherwise try to keep the style consistent. Expressions, expressions, expressions. Expressions are so important in animation, and so is exaggeration. Make your expressions exaggerated. I can't tell you how many times I've seen an animatic where the artist has chosen a very emotional song, but the character seems indifferent because they've tried to make it subtle. Subtlety is of course a valid form of expression, but it requires immense detail in the art to be conveyed effectively. If you're doing comedy, you can't have an understated emotion unless it's deliberately deadpan or set against something more extreme. If your character is sad, make them devastated or pensive or teary-eyed. If they're happy, make them beam or widen their eyes or shut them really tightly in an inverted U shape. Of course there's times where less extreme expressions are needed, but just like shots, they should be diverse. Even boredom can be exaggerated, as can indifference. Make your expressions pop, and make them interesting and captivating, especially if it's a highly emotional or comedic scene. Find the tone and do your best to convey it clearly for the audience, as psychological realism simply doesn't work with cartoons, as you can't see the actual actor's face. Think of cartoons as the commedia dell'arte, or melodramas of the virtual medium. They're meant to be exaggerated and archetypal, and you have to complement the intensity of the actor's performance with your art. In the end, it's up to you how much work you want to put into each individual frame. Some animatic artists are also animators and have short moments of actual animation in their animatics, particularly for important or complicated movements. You might want to do this in yours, or else you might want to do full colour frames and create a clear atmosphere and mood. You might want to do both, as artists such as Inkpots do, but do be aware that this will take a lot of work and learning, and you'll likely need an animation program if you want to create fluid moments of animation. We'll get more into that in the next video, in which I'll explain the editing process. This is actually the most important part of an animatic. Even if all you can draw is stickmen, your animatic could be a masterpiece if you can edit it well. See you in the next video!
All the small things, true care, truth brings.